Miss T, excuse me, I'll need to verify your identification immediately.
The words cut through the sophisticated murmur of conversation in the Executive Federal Aviation Lounge like a knife through silk. Victoria Ashworth's voice carried the kind of calm authority that had opened doors throughout Washington, D.C. for the past 15 years. Her cream-colored Armani power suit hugged her figure perfectly, each line calculated to project competence and control. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a style that whispered expensive salon, and her diamond earrings caught the crystal chandelier light as she approached the man who had just entered the exclusive facility. But the man she addressed didn't look like he belonged in this marble-floored sanctuary of federal power. Marcus Thompson stood near the entrance in a simple navy polo shirt, dark jeans that had seen better days, and canvas sneakers that suggested more comfort than status. His messenger bag was the kind you'd find at any college bookstore, worn leather that spoke of practical use rather than designer luxury. At 42, Marcus carried himself with quiet confidence, but nothing about his appearance suggested he wielded any particular influence or authority. What Victoria Ashworth couldn't know, what none of the 200 federal officials, industry executives, and international delegates in that room could possibly guess, was that the unassuming man she'd just challenged controlled more transportation infrastructure than anyone else in America. Marcus Thompson wasn't just another visitor trying to gain access to the annual Federal Aviation Summit. He was the chairman of the National Transportation Safety Board, a position that gave him oversight authority over every aspect of American aviation safety. More than that, he was the majority shareholder of Apex Holdings, a privately held investment company that controlled 7 major airlines worth a combined $12 billion. But Marcus had learned long ago that real power often worked best when it remained invisible. Today, like every day, he chose to let others underestimate him while he quietly observed how the transportation industry truly operated when it thought no one was watching. 20 years earlier, Marcus Thompson had been crawling through the belly of cargo planes at Memphis International Airport, his hands black with grease, his coveralls soaked with sweat from 12-hour shifts in 100-degree heat. He'd been 22 then, fresh out of community college with an associate degree in aviation mechanics and dreams bigger than the small Arkansas town where he'd grown up. His father had died when Marcus was 16, leaving his mother to work 2 jobs while Marcus finished high school and put himself through technical training. Every dollar mattered in those days. Every opportunity had to be earned twice over. The aviation industry in the early 2000s wasn't particularly welcoming to young black mechanics with ambition. Marcus had applied for pilot training programs at every major airline and been rejected by all of them. The form letters always cited insufficient qualifications or limited openings, but Marcus knew better. He'd seen less qualified applicants, always white, always connected, get fast-tracked into cockpit training, while he remained on the ground fixing the planes they would eventually fly. Instead of becoming bitter, Marcus had decided to become better. He'd worked his shifts maintaining aircraft while spending every free moment studying aviation law, airline economics, and transportation policy. He'd earned his pilot's license on weekends and holidays, paying for flight hours with overtime wages. He'd learned to read financial statements, understand market analysis, and recognize the patterns that separated successful airlines from failing ones. The breakthrough had come in 2008 during the financial crisis that had devastated the aviation industry. Southeastern Regional Airways, a struggling carrier that served small markets throughout Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina, was hemorrhaging money and facing bankruptcy. The airline's 3 aging Boeing 737s were grounded more often than they flew. Their route network made no economic sense, and their customer service had earned them the worst ratings in regional aviation. Marcus had seen opportunity where others saw disaster. He'd mortgaged everything he owned, borrowed against his future earnings, and convinced a small group of investors to help him acquire Southeastern Regional for $30 million. Industry experts had called him crazy. Aviation analysts had predicted he'd lose everything within 2 years. His own mother had begged him to reconsider, terrified that her son was throwing away the financial security she'd never been able to provide. They had all been magnificently wrong. Under Marcus's leadership, Southeastern Regional had been transformed into Atlantic Airways, a carrier that combined operational efficiency with genuine customer service. Marcus had hired pilots based on skill rather than connections-promoted mechanics who understood aircraft rather than office politics, and built a company culture around the radical idea that treating people well was actually good for business. Within 5 years, Atlantic Airways was profitable, well-regarded, and ready for expansion. But Marcus's vision extended far beyond running a single airline. He'd begun quietly acquiring other struggling carriers, always working behind the scenes, never seeking publicity or credit. He'd built Apex Holdings as a private investment company that specialized in turning around failing transportation companies while maintaining the highest safety and service standards in the industry. The personal cost had been enormous. Marcus's wife, Jessica, the college sweetheart he'd married at 24, had supported his aviation dreams even when they meant years of financial uncertainty and 16-hour workdays. She'd been his partner in every sense, handling customer service calls from their kitchen table during Atlantic Airways' early days, while Marcus flew routes and negotiated with creditors. Jessica had celebrated every milestone from their first profitable month to the day Atlantic Airways went public and rang the opening bell at the New York Stock Exchange. Then, 3 years ago, Jessica had died in an airline crash that should never have happened. North Pacific Flight 847 had gone down in a thunderstorm outside Seattle, killing all 127 people aboard. The subsequent investigation, led by Marcus himself in his role as NTSB Chairman, had revealed a pattern of regulatory failures, ignored safety reports, and cost-cutting measures that had prioritized profit over passenger safety. The airline had known about potential issues with de-icing systems for months, but had delayed implementing fixes to avoid operational disruptions during peak travel season. Jessica had been flying to a conference on aviation safety, ironically enough. She'd been working as a consultant helping airlines improve their safety protocols, using the expertise she'd gained during Atlantic Airways' early years. The crash had been preventable. The investigation had been thorough. The responsible parties had been identified and penalized. But Jessica was still gone, and no amount of regulatory reform could bring her back. Marcus's 17-year-old daughter Zoe had inherited her mother's passion for justice and her father's strategic thinking. She was now a sophomore at Georgetown University, majoring in international law with a focus on transportation policy. Zoe understood her father's work in ways that most people couldn't. Having grown up around airline operations and safety discussions, she knew that her father's quiet approach to wielding power wasn't about hiding from responsibility. It was about being more effective by working within the structures that others tried to fight from the outside. Tonight, Marcus was attending the Federal Aviation Summit, not just as an industry leader or regulatory official, but as someone who had seen firsthand how discrimination and negligence could intersect in the transportation sector. He'd experienced bias as a mechanic, prejudice as a pilot, and skepticism as an entrepreneur. Now, with the power to actually change how the industry operated, he chose his battles carefully and fought them strategically. Victoria Ashworth represented everything that Marcus had learned to work around, rather than confront directly. She was Deputy Secretary of Transportation, a political appointee with an impressive resume and powerful connections but limited operational experience in aviation. She controlled budgets, influenced policy, and commanded respect from federal officials who understood that crossing her could end careers. What she didn't understand, and what Marcus was about to demonstrate, was that real authority in the transportation industry didn't always come with official titles or corner offices. Sometimes it came from 20 years of working in the industry at every level, building relationships based on competence rather than connections, and earning respect through results rather than rhetoric. As Victoria approached him with her perfectly manicured confidence, Marcus thought about Jessica's voice during their Sunday evening conversations about workplace bias and professional challenges. She'd always reminded him that the goal wasn't to prove he belonged in rooms where others questioned his presence. The goal was to change the rooms themselves to create environments where future generations wouldn't have to prove their worth based on appearance or assumptions. Today, standing in the exclusive lounge where transportation officials made decisions affecting millions of travelers, Marcus was about to turn a moment of personal discrimination into an opportunity for industry-wide transformation. But first, he would let Victoria Ashworth reveal exactly how she treated people when she thought she had all the power. Marcus looked at Victoria Ashworth with the same calm expression he'd worn in congressional hearings, boardroom negotiations, and crisis management meetings. Her request for identification hadn't surprised him. He'd been expecting this moment since entering the Executive Federal Aviation Lounge 15 minutes earlier. The security checkpoint had already scanned his credentials twice, and his visitor badge clearly displayed his clearance level. But Marcus understood that some challenges had nothing to do with actual security protocols. Of course, Marcus replied evenly, reaching into his wallet to extract his driver's license. No irritation in his voice, no defensive posture, just simple compliance with what appeared to be a routine request. He handed the plastic card to Victoria, noting how she accepted it with 2 fingers as if handling something potentially contaminated. Victoria studied the license with theatrical intensity, her blue eyes moving between Marcus's face and the photograph on his identification. She held the card close to her reading glasses, angling it toward the crystal chandelier light, as if searching for evidence of forgery. Around them, conversations continued in the marble-floored space, but several federal officials had begun glancing in their direction with curiosity. Marcus Thompson Victoria read aloud, her voice carrying far enough to be heard by nearby executives. Washington, D.C. address. She paused, tapping her manicured fingernail against the license. This shows you as 6'1", but you seem... She gestured vaguely. Different. Elena Rodriguez, the Federal Aviation Security Supervisor, had been watching the interaction from her position near the registration desk. At 29, Elena had worked in transportation security for 7 years, and she'd never seen Deputy Secretary Ashworth personally verify a visitor's identification. Standard protocol involved security staff background checks and pre-approved access lists. Senior officials like Victoria typically interacted with visitors only after all security clearances had been confirmed through proper channels. Elena approached the pair with professional concern. Deputy Secretary Ashworth, is there an issue with Mr. Thompson's clearance? Our advanced security team processed his credentials this morning and everything appeared to be in order. Victoria turned toward Elena with the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. Supervisor Rodriguez, I appreciate your diligence, but as Deputy Secretary I maintain discretionary authority over access verification in federal facilities. Mr. Thompson's credentials require enhanced review. Enhanced review for what specific security concern? Elena asked, her voice carefully professional despite the growing discomfort she felt about the situation. Marcus remained silent, observing the interaction between the 2 women, while mentally cataloging every word and gesture. This wasn't his first experience with pretextual security screening, and he understood that arguing would only escalate the situation without resolving the underlying issue. Better to let Victoria reveal her motivations clearly before responding. Security concerns don't require detailed explanation to subordinate personnel, Victoria replied, her tone sharpening slightly. She turned back to Marcus, still holding his driver's license. Mr. Thompson, what brings you to the Federal Aviation Summit today? James Mitchell, a 36-year-old senior transportation aide, had been recording personal notes on his phone when Victoria's raised voice caught his attention. James worked for Congressman David Park, the ranking member of the House Transportation Committee, and he'd been documenting interesting conversations and policy discussions throughout the summit. The interaction between Victoria and the unassuming man in casual clothes seemed worth recording, especially given Victoria's unusually aggressive approach to what should have been routine credential verification. James discreetly activated his phone's live stream function, angling the camera to capture the conversation without being obvious about his documentation. His small but engaged following of transportation policy enthusiasts would find this interesting, particularly if Deputy Secretary Ashworth was overstepping her authority. Sarah Hamilton, the airport VIP services manager, approached the group with the professional warmth that had made her successful in hospitality roles throughout her 20-year career. At 51, Sarah had seen enough high-level government interactions to recognize when situations were developing beyond normal protocols. She'd also developed an excellent memory for faces, and something about Marcus Thompson seemed familiar in a way she couldn't quite identify. "Good afternoon, Deputy Secretary Ashworth," Sarah said with practiced diplomacy. "Is there anything I can assist with regarding Mr. Thompson's visit today? Our VIP services team is available to help resolve any credential questions through appropriate channels." Victoria glanced at Sarah with barely concealed irritation. "Miss Hamilton, this matter falls under federal security jurisdiction rather than airport hospitality services. Mr. Thompson's identification requires verification against federal databases before his access can be confirmed." Marcus watched the interaction with growing interest. Victoria was creating an unnecessarily complex situation around what should have been a simple credential check. Her language about federal databases and enhanced verification suggested she was either confused about actual security protocols or deliberately manufacturing complications for reasons that had nothing to do with legitimate security concerns. "I'm happy to cooperate with any verification process," Marcus said, his first words since handing over his identification. His voice carried no defensiveness or challenge, just professional courtesy. "What additional information do you need?" Victoria pulled out her government phone and began typing rapidly. "I'm checking your credentials against the Transportation Security Administration's federal contractor database. Sometimes people attempt to access high-level federal facilities with questionable documentation." The phrase "questionable documentation" hung in the air like an accusation. Elena shifted uncomfortably, recognizing that Victoria was implying fraud without any evidence to support such a serious allegation. James's live stream was beginning to attract viewers, as his followers noticed the unusual nature of the recorded interaction. Sarah's memory suddenly provided a connection she hadn't expected. "Mr. Thompson," she said carefully, "haven't we met before? You look familiar, though I can't quite place where." Marcus smiled slightly. "I travel frequently for business. We might have crossed paths at various airports or transportation events." Victoria finished her phone consultation and returned to Marcus with renewed authority. "Mr. Thompson, the preliminary database search shows some inconsistencies with your federal access credentials. I'll need to conduct a more thorough verification before your access to this facility can be confirmed." What kind of inconsistencies? Elena asked, her professional training compelling her to understand the specific security concerns that would justify extended credential verification. "That information is classified at levels above your clearance supervisor," Rodriguez. Victoria replied dismissively. She turned back to Marcus. "Sir, I'll need you to accompany me to a secure verification area where we can resolve these credential questions through proper federal channels." Marcus considered his options carefully. He could reveal his identity immediately and end this charade, but doing so would prevent him from observing how Victoria treated visitors when she believed she had unchallenged authority. The interaction was already being documented by James's live stream, and Elena's obvious discomfort suggested that other federal personnel recognized Victoria's unusual approach to routine security procedures. More importantly, Marcus understood that his experience represented a larger pattern of how certain officials treated people who didn't immediately project power or influence. By allowing the situation to develop, he was gathering evidence of behavior that likely affected other visitors who lacked his hidden authority to address such treatment. "I'm happy to cooperate with additional verification," Marcus said. "But I'd prefer to complete the process here in the presence of witnesses rather than in a private location." Victoria's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Mr. Thompson, federal security protocols aren't subject to your personal preferences. You'll accompany me for enhanced verification or your access to this facility will be terminated immediately." The ultimatum was delivered with the kind of absolute confidence that came from years of having federal authority respected without question. Victoria had clearly expected immediate compliance, and Marcus's calm refusal to be moved to a private location had disrupted her planned approach. James's live stream had grown to over 1,000 viewers, many of whom were posting questions in the chat about what they were witnessing. The transportation policy community was small enough that Victoria Ashworth was recognized by name, and viewers were beginning to express concern about her aggressive approach to what appeared to be routine credential verification. Elena stepped closer to Marcus. "Sir, if you're comfortable proceeding with verification here, that's actually more consistent with standard federal security protocols. Enhanced verification typically doesn't require private locations unless there are specific safety concerns." Victoria turned toward Elena with obvious irritation. "Supervisor Rodriguez, your comments are inappropriate and unhelpful. I'll be recommending a review of your understanding of federal security protocols." The threat was delivered quietly but clearly, and everyone present understood that Victoria was using her position to intimidate Elena into silence. Marcus noted the exchange with a particular interest, recognizing that Victoria's behavior revealed as much about her character as her treatment of him. Deputy Secretary Ashworth Marcus said, his voice remaining calm despite the escalating tension, "I believe we can resolve this situation efficiently if you'll simply explain the specific security concerns that require additional verification of my credentials." Victoria stared at him for a long moment, clearly frustrated by his refusal to be either intimidated or removed from the public space. "Mr. Thompson, your questions about federal security protocols suggest you may not fully understand the authority of this office or the seriousness of these proceedings." The implied threat was unmistakable, and Marcus recognized that Victoria had reached the point where she was willing to use federal authority to compel compliance with requests that had no legitimate security justification. The interaction had provided exactly the kind of evidence he'd suspected he would find, but he was curious to see how far Victoria was willing to go when her authority was quietly questioned rather than immediately accepted. Marcus Thompson's mind drifted to a memory from 20 years ago as Victoria Ashworth continued her theatrical examination of his driver's license. He had been 24 then, freshly licensed as a pilot, and applying for positions with every major airline that would accept his resume. The interview at Transglobal Airways had seemed promising until the final meeting with the chief pilot, a weathered man in his 50s who had looked Marcus up and down with unconcealed skepticism. "Son," the chief pilot had said, leaning back in his leather chair, "you've got the technical qualifications, but I'm not sure you'd fit in with our crew culture. Our pilots need to project authority, especially when dealing with high-value passengers and international routes." Marcus had understood exactly what the man meant, even though the words had been carefully chosen to avoid explicit discrimination. The message was clear: talented young black pilots might have the skills to fly planes, but they couldn't be trusted to represent the airline's image in first-class cabins and VIP lounges. The memory had hardened into resolve over the years. Rather than fighting individual battles against bias that would limit his career advancement, Marcus had decided to build his own company, where competence mattered more than appearance, and results spoke louder than assumptions. Now, standing in the Executive Federal Aviation Lounge while Victoria manufactured security concerns about his credentials, Marcus felt the familiar mixture of disappointment and determination that had driven him to transform the transportation industry from within. The difference was that today he possessed the authority to address discriminatory treatment at an industry-wide level. Victoria returned from her extended consultation with federal databases, her expression suggesting she'd discovered information that justified her suspicious approach. "Mr. Thompson," she announced loudly enough to be heard across the marble-floored space, "the verification process has revealed some concerning discrepancies in your background information." Elena Rodriguez frowned, recognizing that Victoria's language implied serious security issues without providing specific details. "What kind of discrepancies, Deputy Secretary?" "If there are legitimate security concerns, shouldn't we involve the Federal Protective Service Supervisor Rodriguez Victoria?" replied with ice-cold authority. Your questions suggest you may not fully understand the jurisdiction and discretion of this office. I'll handle security determinations according to federal protocols that don't require your input or approval. James Mitchell's live stream had grown to 15,000 viewers as word spread through transportation policy circles about the unusual confrontation developing at the Federal Aviation Summit. His followers were posting increasingly critical comments about Victoria's aggressive approach to what appeared to be routine credential verification. Sarah Hamilton watched the interaction with growing unease, her hospitality experience telling her that the situation was escalating beyond any reasonable security protocol. Deputy Secretary Ashworth, she said diplomatically, if there are concerns about Mr. Thompson's credentials, our VIP services team can contact the appropriate federal agencies to resolve any questions quickly and professionally. Victoria turned toward Sarah with barely controlled irritation. Miss Hamilton Airport Hospitality Services have no authority over federal security matters. Your suggestions are inappropriate and potentially disruptive to legitimate security operations. Marcus observed the exchange with particular interest. Victoria was steadily intimidating anyone who questioned her approach, using her federal position to suppress challenges to behavior that clearly exceeded normal security protocols. The pattern suggested someone accustomed to having authority respected without question, regardless of whether that authority was being exercised appropriately. Deputy Secretary Ashworth Marcus said quietly, "I'd like to understand what specific discrepancies you've found in my background information. As the subject of this security review, I believe I have a right to know what concerns have been identified." Victoria stared at him with the kind of cold assessment typically reserved for hostile witnesses or uncooperative suspects. "Mr. Thompson, your background check shows inconsistencies between your claimed identity and federal database records. Specifically, there are questions about your employment history, financial status, and the legitimacy of your stated reasons for attending this summit. The allegations were serious enough to justify extended security screening if they were true, but vague enough to be impossible to refute without access to the same databases Victoria claimed to be consulting. Marcus recognized the technique as a classic abuse of federal authority, creating concerns that couldn't be verified or disputed by the subject of investigation. Elena stepped closer to Marcus, her security training compelling her to understand the situation despite Victoria's obvious displeasure with questions. "Sir, if you're comfortable sharing what organization are you representing at today's summit, that might help clarify any database inconsistencies." Marcus appreciated Elena's attempt to de-escalate the situation through legitimate information sharing. "I'm here as a federal appointee attending policy discussions related to transportation safety and aviation oversight." Victoria's eyebrows rose with theatrical surprise. "Federal appointee, Mr. Thompson, our database shows no record of any federal appointment associated with your identity. This suggests either fraudulent claims or serious administrative oversights in federal personnel management." The implication that Marcus was lying about his federal role was delivered with enough volume to be heard by nearby executives, several of whom had begun watching the interaction with obvious curiosity. James's live-stream chat was exploding with comments from viewers who recognized that the confrontation had moved beyond routine security screening into something that resembled public intimidation. Sarah Hamilton's memory finally provided the connection she'd been struggling to identify. "Mr. Thompson," she said carefully, "didn't I see you on C-SPAN last month? There was a congressional hearing about aviation safety regulations, and I remember thinking the witness looked familiar." Marcus smiled slightly. "I do occasionally testify before Congress on transportation policy matters." Victoria's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, the first sign that her confidence in the situation might be wavering. "Mr. Thompson, if you claim to have federal appointments or congressional testimony experience, I'll need additional documentation to verify those claims. Please provide additional identification beyond your driver's license." The second ID request was delivered with the same authoritative tone, but Marcus detected a slight edge of uncertainty that hadn't been present earlier. Victoria was beginning to suspect that her target might possess more credibility than his casual appearance suggested, but she'd committed too deeply to her aggressive approach to retreat gracefully. Marcus reached into his wallet again, this time extracting his federal government identification card. The card bore his photograph, name, and the seal of the National Transportation Safety Board, along with security features that clearly identified it as legitimate federal credentials. Victoria accepted the card with obvious reluctance, recognizing that Marcus had just provided documentation that directly contradicted her claims about database inconsistencies and fraudulent identity assertions. She studied the federal ID with the same theatrical intensity she'd applied to his driver's license, but her body language had shifted from confident authority to defensive scrutiny. Elena glanced at the federal ID over Victoria's shoulder, her eyes widening as she recognized the NTSB seal and Marcus's title as chairman. "Deputy Secretary Ashworth," she said quietly, "that appears to be legitimate federal identification from the Transportation Safety Board." Victoria continued examining the card without responding to Elena's observation, clearly stalling while she considered how to proceed. She'd publicly questioned Marcus's identity and federal credentials, but his documentation appeared to support exactly the claims she'd characterized as fraudulent or suspicious. James's live stream had reached 25,000 viewers, many of whom were transportation industry professionals who recognized the significance of NTSB identification. Comments in the chat were becoming increasingly critical of Victoria's approach, with several viewers questioning whether Deputy Secretary Ashworth understood the authority and jurisdiction of the Transportation Safety Board. Marcus waited patiently while Victoria continued her examination of his federal ID, understanding that she was struggling to find a way to continue her aggressive approach in the face of legitimate credentials that contradicted her stated concerns. The situation had reached a decision point. Victoria could either acknowledge that her security concerns had been addressed and allow him to proceed, or she could escalate further by questioning the legitimacy of federal identification that was clearly authentic. "Mr. Thompson," Victoria finally said, "this federal identification requires additional verification through appropriate channels. As Deputy Secretary of Transportation, I maintain oversight authority over federal transportation agencies, including verification of personnel credentials when security questions arise." Marcus noted with interest that Victoria was now claiming oversight authority over the NTSB, an independent agency that reported directly to Congress rather than through the Department of Transportation hierarchy. Her assertion revealed either a fundamental misunderstanding of federal transportation governance or a deliberate misrepresentation of her authority to justify continued harassment. Deputy Secretary Ashworth Elena said with growing concern the Transportation Safety Board is an independent federal agency. Department of Transportation officials typically don't have direct oversight authority over NTSB personnel or credentials. Victoria turned toward Elena with barely controlled fury. "Supervisor Rodriguez, your comments suggest a serious misunderstanding of federal agency relationships and jurisdictional authority. I'll be recommending a comprehensive review of your security clearance and federal employment status." The threat was delivered with enough venom to make Elena step back involuntarily, but Marcus noted that several nearby federal officials had overheard Victoria's angry response. Her reaction to legitimate questions about jurisdictional authority suggested someone who was accustomed to having federal power respected, without question, regardless of whether that power was being exercised within appropriate bounds. Marcus's phone vibrated with an incoming text message from his Chief of Staff, Chairman Thompson. "Secretary Williams is asking about your arrival time for the safety protocol briefing. Shall I tell him you're running late?" The message reminded Marcus that he was due to deliver the opening presentation at today's summit, a fact that would become relevant very soon. But for now, he was content to let Victoria continue demonstrating how she treated federal personnel when she believed she had unchallenged authority to do so. Victoria Ashworth had learned early in life that authority was something you either possessed or submitted to, and she had spent her 48 years ensuring she was never in the second category. Born Victoria Elizabeth Carmichael in McLean, Virginia, she was the daughter of Thomas Carmichael, a legendary transportation industry lobbyist who had shaped federal aviation policy for 3 decades, and Margaret Sinclair Carmichael, whose family had owned one of the oldest freight railroad companies in the Southeast until they sold it to Norfolk Southern for $800 million in 1995. Growing up in a 12-room colonial house with a circular driveway and views of the Potomac River Victoria, had absorbed lessons about power that most people never learned. Her father's home office was where senators called to discuss transportation committee votes, where airline executives came to strategize about regulatory challenges, and where cabinet secretaries sought advice on policy positions that would affect millions of travelers. Victoria had been 7 years old when she first understood that some people made the rules while others followed them. Her father was entertaining the newly appointed Secretary of Transportation in their living room discussing highway funding legislation that would determine which states received billions in federal infrastructure money. The Secretary had deferred to Thomas Carmichael's judgment on technical details, political strategy, and even the timing of public announcements. Daddy Victoria had asked that evening, "Why does the Transportation Secretary ask you what to do?" "Isn't he supposed to be the boss?" Thomas Carmichael had smiled and pulled his daughter onto his lap. "Sweetheart," he'd explained, "the people with titles aren't always the people with power. Real authority comes from understanding how the system works and knowing how to make it work for you." That lesson had shaped every decision Victoria made for the next 4 decades. At Holton Arms School, Victoria had been student body president, debate team captain, and valedictorian of her graduating class. She'd learned to project confidence that commanded attention, to speak with authority that discouraged challenges, and to use intelligence as a weapon when charm and connections weren't sufficient. Her Harvard Law School application essay had been titled "Transportation Policy as National Security Strategy," and her acceptance letter had arrived along with invitations to join the Harvard Law Review and the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy. Victoria's law school years had been marked by academic excellence and strategic relationship building. She'd clerked for Justice Anthony Kennedy during his final term on the Supreme Court, authored law review articles on federal transportation regulation, and graduated magna cum laude with a specialization in administrative law and federal regulatory policy. Her entry into federal government had been carefully orchestrated through her father's network of connections. A staff position with the Senate Transportation Committee had led to Deputy General Counsel at the Department of Transportation, then Associate Deputy Secretary, and finally her current position as Deputy Secretary, the second highest official in the federal transportation hierarchy. Victoria understood federal transportation policy better than almost anyone in Washington. She could analyze the economic impact of aviation regulations, explain the constitutional basis for interstate commerce jurisdiction over transportation, and navigate the political complexities of infrastructure spending with expertise that impressed even career federal employees. Her intelligence was genuine, her policy knowledge was comprehensive, and her political instincts were finely tuned. But Victoria had also learned to view federal authority as something that belonged to people like her, well-educated, well-connected, and well-positioned within the traditional power structures that governed American transportation policy. Her worldview was shaped by exclusive prep schools where diversity meant students from different European ancestries, by Harvard Law School, where merit was measured by standardized test scores and family connections, and by Washington social circles where influence flowed through networks that had been decades in the making. The Federal Aviation Summit represented the pinnacle of Victoria's professional achievement. As Deputy Secretary, she was responsible for coordinating policy discussions between federal agencies, international aviation authorities, and industry leaders. Tomorrow, she would deliver the keynote address on federal transportation priorities for the next decade, a speech that would be covered by aviation trade publications, transportation policy journals, and major newspapers. More importantly, Victoria understood that her performance at this summit would influence her prospects for nomination as Transportation Secretary when the current secretary retired next year. The political gossip network that connected Washington law firms, consulting companies, and federal agencies had already identified Victoria as the leading candidate for promotion. But federal appointments required more than policy expertise and political connections. Victoria needed to demonstrate that she possessed the kind of executive presence and decisive leadership that commanded respect from Congress industry leaders and international officials. She needed to show that she could handle complex situations with authority and composure, that her judgment could be trusted in crisis situations, and that her leadership style would enhance rather than complicate the department's relationship with other federal agencies. The interaction with Marcus Thompson had begun as routine security, screening the kind of discretionary verification that deputy secretaries were expected to perform when unfamiliar individuals appeared in high-security federal facilities. Victoria's initial request for identification had been motivated by legitimate security consciousness. She genuinely noticed Marcus's casual appearance and wondered whether he belonged in a facility restricted to senior federal officials and industry executives. But Marcus's calm compliance with her requests, combined with his unassuming appearance and patient demeanor, had triggered something deeper in Victoria's approach to authority. She'd recognized that he wasn't responding to her federal position with the immediate deference she typically received, and his questions about security protocols had suggested someone who felt entitled to explanations rather than simply accepting her directives without question. Victoria had built her career on the understanding that federal authority was meant to be respected rather than questioned, especially by individuals who lacked obvious credentials or connections within the transportation policy community. Marcus's persistence in seeking explanations for her security concerns had felt like a challenge to her position, and Victoria's response had been to demonstrate exactly how much authority she possessed when dealing with people who didn't immediately recognize her status. The live-stream documentation by James Mitchell had added an element of public scrutiny that Victoria found particularly irritating. She'd noticed James's phone recording the interaction, and she understood that transportation policy circles were small enough that news of her approach to security screening would spread quickly through professional networks. Rather than moderating her behavior, Victoria had decided to demonstrate that federal authority was more important than public relations concerns. Elena Rodriguez's questions about security protocols had been especially frustrating because they'd come from a subordinate federal employee who was supposed to support, rather than question, senior officials' decisions. Victoria viewed Elena's concerns as insubordination, disguised as professional inquiry, and her threats about security clearance review had been intended to discourage further challenges to her authority. Sarah Hamilton's attempts to de-escalate the situation through airport hospitality services had struck Victoria as inappropriate civilian interference in federal security matters. The suggestion that VIP services could contact appropriate federal agencies to resolve credential questions had implied that Victoria's approach was somehow inappropriate or excessive, an implication that Victoria found both insulting and professionally threatening. Marcus's federal identification had created a new set of challenges for Victoria's approach. She'd committed publicly to questioning his credentials and identity, but his NTSB ID clearly contradicted her assertions about database inconsistencies and fraudulent claims. Rather than acknowledging that her security concerns had been addressed, Victoria had decided to escalate by claiming oversight authority over NTSB credentials, a jurisdictional assertion that was questionable at best and potentially embarrassing if challenged by someone who understood federal agency relationships. Victoria understood that she'd reached a decision point in the interaction. She could acknowledge that Marcus's credentials were legitimate and allow him to proceed, which would require implicitly admitting that her aggressive approach had been unnecessary. Alternatively, she could continue escalating by demanding additional verification or enhanced security screening, which would require her to justify increasingly questionable uses of federal authority. The presence of witnesses and live-stream documentation meant that Victoria's decision would be observed and potentially critiqued by transportation industry professionals who understood federal security protocols. Her response would either demonstrate decisive leadership under challenging circumstances or reveal someone who abused federal authority when faced with questions about her approach. Victoria had spent 48 years learning that real power meant never having to back down from challenges to your authority. Today, standing in the Executive Federal Aviation Lounge with her reputation and future prospects at stake, she was about to test whether that philosophy would serve her well when applied to someone whose hidden authority exceeded her own. Mr. Thompson. Victoria's voice cut through the ambient conversation in the Executive Federal Aviation Lounge with the precision of a federal prosecutor delivering an indictment. This is your final opportunity to provide complete and truthful identification before I involve federal law enforcement in resolving what appears to be a serious security breach. She returned from her consultation with Deputy Administrator Reynolds, flanked now by Federal Air Marshal David Chen and Department of Transportation Inspector General Investigator Patricia Wells. The presence of federal law enforcement officials had drawn the attention of every person within 30 feet, creating a semicircle of observers who watched with mixture of curiosity and unease. Marcus Thompson remained precisely where Victoria had left him standing, calmly near the marble registration desk with his hands at his sides and his expression unchanged. His navy polo shirt and worn jeans looked even more out of place now that he was surrounded by federal officials in dark suits, but his posture suggested someone accustomed to pressure rather than intimidated by authority. Elena Rodriguez had positioned herself close enough to observe the interaction while maintaining her professional responsibilities as Federal Aviation Security Supervisor. Her discomfort with Victoria's escalating approach was evident in her expression, but she understood that questioning a deputy secretary in front of federal investigators could end her career, regardless of whether her concerns were legitimate. James Mitchell's live stream had exploded to over 50,000 concurrent viewers as news of the confrontation spread through transportation policy networks and social media. His audience included airline executives, federal employees, aviation journalists, and transportation law specialists, many of whom were posting increasingly critical comments about Victoria's approach to what had begun as routine credential verification. Sarah Hamilton stood slightly behind Elena, her hospitality experience, telling her that the situation had moved far beyond anything that could be resolved through normal customer service channels. She'd been trying to identify where she'd seen Marcus Thompson before, and the memory was beginning to solidify around congressional hearings and transportation safety briefings she'd watched on C-SPAN. Federal Air Marshal Chen stepped forward with the professional demeanor of someone trained to handle security threats without creating unnecessary drama. "Sir," he addressed Marcus directly. Deputy Secretary Ashworth has requested federal law enforcement assistance with credential verification. I'll need you to provide all identification documents and submit to enhanced security screening. Marcus looked from Chen to Victoria, understanding that she'd escalated the situation to a level that would require either complete compliance or direct confrontation. The presence of an Inspector General investigator suggested that Victoria was treating this as a potential criminal matter rather than administrative confusion. Marshal Chen Marcus replied calmly, "I've already provided my driver's license and federal identification to Deputy Secretary Ashworth. What additional documentation do you need?" Victoria stepped between Marcus and the Air Marshal, her authority clearly established despite the presence of federal law enforcement. "Mr. Thompson, your previous identification has raised serious questions about your identity and your authorization to access this federal facility. Marshal Chen will conduct comprehensive verification through enhanced security protocols." Patricia Wells, the Inspector General investigator, consulted her tablet before addressing the group. "Sir, preliminary database searches show inconsistencies between your claimed identity and federal personnel records. We'll need to resolve these discrepancies before determining your authorization status." Marcus noted with interest that Victoria had convinced federal investigators that legitimate security concerns existed despite having provided authentic identification documents. The assertion about database inconsistencies suggested either deliberate misrepresentation or fundamental confusion about federal personnel management among senior transportation officials. Miss Wells Marcus said, "What specific inconsistencies have you identified? I'd like to understand what concerns require enhanced security screening beyond standard credential verification." Wells glanced at Victoria before responding clearly, deferring to the Deputy Secretary's assessment of the situation. "Sir, that information is part of an ongoing security investigation. Enhanced screening will help resolve questions about your identity and authorization status." Elena Rodriguez had reached the limit of her ability to remain silent while observing what appeared to be an abuse of federal security protocols. Deputy Secretary Ashworth, she said carefully, enhanced security screening typically requires specific security concerns or credible threats. Has the department identified particular risks that justify extraordinary measures? Victoria turned toward Elena with barely controlled fury. "Supervisor Rodriguez, your continued interference with federal security operations is inappropriate and potentially obstructive. Marshal Chen, please note Supervisor Rodriguez's behavior for inclusion in my formal report about today's security incident." The threat was delivered with enough ice to make Elena step back, but Marcus observed that several nearby federal officials had overheard Victoria's angry response to legitimate questions about security protocols. James's live stream chat was exploding with comments from viewers who recognized that Victoria was using federal authority to intimidate employees who questioned her approach. Marcus's phone buzzed with another text message from his chief of staff. "Chairman Thompson, Transportation Secretary Williams is personally asking about your location. The safety briefing was scheduled to begin 10 minutes ago. Shall I explain that you're delayed?" Marcus considered his options. He could end the situation immediately by allowing his staff to contact Secretary Williams, who would undoubtedly resolve the matter within seconds by explaining Marcus's identity to Victoria. Alternatively, he could continue allowing Victoria to demonstrate how she treated people when she believed she had unchallenged federal authority. Deputy Secretary Ashworth Marcus said quietly, "I notice that your security concerns have escalated significantly since I provided federal identification from the National Transportation Safety Board. Can you explain what additional risks have been identified that require enhanced screening of NTSB personnel?" Victoria stared at him with the kind of cold assessment typically reserved for hostile witnesses or uncooperative suspects. "Mr. Thompson, your questions about federal security protocols suggest unfamiliarity with appropriate procedures for high-level federal facilities. Enhanced screening will help determine whether your claimed federal credentials are legitimate." The implication that his NTSB identification might be fraudulent was serious enough to constitute defamation if broadcast to the thousands of people watching James's live stream. Marcus recognized that Victoria had committed to a course of action that would require her to either acknowledge error or make increasingly serious accusations about his identity and federal credentials. Sarah Hamilton's memory suddenly clicked into place with perfect clarity. "Mr. Thompson," she said with growing excitement, "you're the NTSB Chairman who testified before Congress last month about the North Pacific Airlines crash investigation. I remember watching your testimony on C-SPAN. The identification was delivered loudly enough to be heard by everyone in the surrounding circle, and Marcus noted the immediate change in body language among federal officials who recognized the significance of NTSB Chairman credentials." Elena Rodriguez's eyes widened with understanding, while Federal Air Marshal Chen glanced uncertainly between Marcus and Victoria. Victoria's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, the first clear sign that her confidence in the situation was wavering. Miss Hamilton witness identification during security investigations can be unreliable and potentially disruptive to legitimate law enforcement procedures. James Mitchell's live stream audience had reached 75,000 viewers, many of whom were now posting information about Marcus Thompson's role as NTSB Chairman and his recent congressional testimony about airline safety regulations. Comments in the chat were becoming increasingly supportive of Marcus and critical of Victoria's approach. Marcus's phone rang with an incoming call from Transportation Secretary Williams himself. Deputy Secretary Ashworth Marcus said calmly, "I believe this call might help resolve your security concerns." Victoria watched suspiciously as Marcus answered his phone, clearly expecting some kind of deception or misdirection that would support her claims about fraudulent credentials. "Good afternoon, Secretary," Williams Marcus said, his voice carrying clearly in the marble-floored space. "I'm currently in the Executive Federal Aviation Lounge experiencing some delays with security screening procedures." Victoria's face went pale as she recognized the voice coming from Marcus's phone. Transportation Secretary Michael Williams was her direct supervisor, the man who controlled her career prospects and determined her future in federal service. "Marcus." Secretary Williams's voice was audible to everyone within 10 feet. "What kind of security delays? You're supposed to be delivering the opening briefing on new safety protocols in 5 minutes." The conversation continued with Secretary Williams expressing confusion about why the NTSB Chairman was experiencing security difficulties at a federal aviation summit where his presence had been specifically requested by the White House Office of Transportation Policy. Victoria realized that she'd spent the past 30 minutes publicly challenging the credentials and identity of one of the most senior transportation officials in the federal government, someone who reported directly to Congress rather than through the Department of Transportation hierarchy, and whose authority in aviation safety matters exceeded her own. Patricia Wells, the Inspector General investigator, stepped closer to Victoria with obvious concern. "Deputy Secretary Ashworth, if this individual is actually NTSB Chairman Thompson, our enhanced security screening appears to be based on incorrect information about his identity and credentials." Victoria stared at Marcus with the dawning realization that her aggressive approach to credential verification had been observed and documented by thousands of people, including federal employees, transportation industry executives, and aviation policy specialists who understood the significance of her mistake. Marcus ended his call with Secretary Williams and looked directly at Victoria. "Deputy Secretary Ashworth, I believe Secretary Williams would like to speak with you about today's security procedures. He's particularly interested in understanding why NTSB personnel are experiencing enhanced screening at federal aviation events." The offer was delivered with the same calm courtesy Marcus had maintained throughout the confrontation, but Victoria understood that accepting the call would require her to explain to her direct supervisor why she'd spent 30 minutes challenging the identity of a senior federal official whose credentials were a matter of public record. Elena Rodriguez approached Marcus with obvious relief and professional embarrassment. "Chairman Thompson, I apologize for the confusion about your credentials. Federal aviation security should have resolved this situation much more efficiently." Marcus smiled reassuringly. "Supervisor Rodriguez, you handled this situation professionally despite difficult circumstances. Your questions about security protocols were appropriate and helpful." Federal Air Marshal Chen consulted his own phone, clearly receiving updated information about Marcus's identity and federal credentials. "Chairman Thompson, I apologize for any inconvenience with the security screening procedures. Your credentials are confirmed through multiple federal databases." Victoria stood frozen in the center of the circle, understanding that she'd created a situation that would require either immediate acknowledgement of error or continued escalation against someone whose federal authority was now clearly established. The presence of thousands of live-stream viewers meant that her decision would be observed and critiqued by transportation industry professionals who understood the significance of challenging NTSB authority without justification. James Mitchell's livestream had become the most watched transportation policy event of the year, with viewers sharing clips across social media platforms and transportation industry forums. Victoria's confrontation with Marcus Thompson was already being analyzed by aviation lawyers, federal personnel specialists, and government ethics experts. Marcus waited patiently for Victoria's response, understanding that she'd reached a decision point that would define not only this interaction but her future credibility within federal transportation leadership. The next few minutes would determine whether Victoria could acknowledge error gracefully or would continue escalating against someone whose hidden authority had just been revealed to exceed her own. Elena Rodriguez had worked in federal aviation security for 7 years, and she'd never witnessed anything like what was unfolding in the Executive Federal Aviation Lounge. As Federal Aviation Security Supervisor, she understood protocols, procedures, and the appropriate chain of authority for handling credential verification. What Deputy Secretary Ashworth was doing bore no resemblance to legitimate federal security operations. Deputy Secretary Ashworth Elena said, her voice carefully modulated to maintain professional courtesy while expressing serious concerns. I've observed this entire interaction from the beginning. Chairman Thompson provided legitimate federal identification 30 minutes ago. Our continued detention appears to exceed standard security protocols. Victoria turned toward Elena with the kind of cold fury typically reserved for subordinates who had committed serious professional violations. Supervisor Rodriguez, your repeated interference with federal security operations constitutes insubordination and potentially criminal obstruction of federal law enforcement activities. The threat was delivered with enough venom to make Elena step back involuntarily, but she'd reached the point where remaining silent would compromise her professional integrity and potentially violate her oath to uphold federal security standards. Ma'am, Elena replied, I'm responsible for security operations in this facility. Detaining federal officials without legitimate security justification could constitute a violation of federal personnel protection regulations. I need to understand the specific threat assessment that justifies enhanced screening of NTSB personnel. James Mitchell's live stream had reached 100,000 concurrent viewers, as transportation industry networks shared links and aviation policy specialists tuned in to witness what was becoming the most dramatic confrontation in federal transportation circles in years. His audience included airline executives, federal employees, congressional staff members, and international aviation officials who recognized the significance of what they were watching. This is absolutely extraordinary, James narrated quietly to his audience. We're witnessing a Deputy Secretary of Transportation publicly challenge the credentials of the NTSB Chairman despite having received legitimate federal identification that clearly establishes his identity and authority. The live stream chat was moving too fast to read, with viewers posting everything from legal analysis of federal personnel protection laws to criticism of Victoria's approach to commentary about Marcus's remarkable composure under pressure. Sarah Hamilton approached Marcus with the kind of professional warmth that had made her successful in VIP services throughout her 20-year hospitality career. Chairman Thompson, she said quietly, I want to apologize for this situation. Our VIP services team should have prevented these complications through proper advance coordination. Marcus smiled reassuringly. Miss Hamilton, this situation isn't related to airport operations or hospitality services. You've handled everything professionally. Sarah turned toward Victoria with diplomatic but firm resolve. Deputy Secretary Ashworth Chairman Thompson is a recognized federal official whose testimony before Congress has been covered extensively in transportation industry publications. Our continued security screening appears to be based on administrative confusion rather than legitimate security concerns. Victoria stared at Sarah with barely concealed irritation. Miss Hamilton Airport hospitality personnel have no authority to assess federal security operations or make determinations about the appropriateness of enhanced screening procedures. But Sarah had spent 2 decades working with federal officials, and she understood the difference between legitimate security concerns and administrative power plays. Ma'am, I'm not assessing security operations. I'm providing factual information about Chairman Thompson's public role in federal transportation policy. Federal Air Marshal Chen had been consulting his own databases and communications networks, and his expression suggested growing concern about the situation he'd been asked to support. Deputy Secretary Ashworth, he said carefully, my federal law enforcement databases confirmed Chairman Thompson's identity and credentials. I'm not seeing security concerns that would justify enhanced screening. Victoria turned towards Chen with obvious displeasure. Marshal Chen, your role is to provide security support, not to question the security assessments of senior federal officials. I'm directing you to proceed with enhanced screening procedures. Chen hesitated, recognizing that Victoria was asking him to detain a senior federal official whose credentials had been verified through multiple databases. Ma'am, enhanced screening of federal personnel typically requires specific threat assessments or credible security intelligence. Can you provide documentation of the security concerns that justify these procedures? Patricia Wells, the Inspector General investigator, had been reviewing federal personnel databases on her tablet, and her expression suggested she'd discovered information that complicated Victoria's security narrative. Deputy Secretary Ashworth, she said quietly, "My review of federal personnel records shows Chairman Thompson's credentials are current and properly documented. I'm not identifying database inconsistencies that would support enhanced security screening." Victoria stared at Wells with growing desperation, understanding that the federal investigators she'd summoned to support her position were instead raising questions about her assessment of security concerns. Marcus watched the exchange with particular interest, noting how Victoria responded when her authority was questioned by multiple federal personnel simultaneously. Her reaction revealed someone accustomed to having directives followed without scrutiny, regardless of whether those directives were based on legitimate security concerns or personal judgment. Elena Rodriguez stepped closer to Marcus, her professional conscience compelling her to address what had become an obvious abuse of security protocols. "Chairman Thompson," she said formally on behalf of Federal Aviation Security, "I apologize for the irregularities in today's credential verification. Your access to this facility should have been confirmed immediately upon presentation of valid federal identification." Victoria whirled towards Elena with unconcealed fury. "Supervisor Rodriguez, you are formally relieved of security responsibilities for this facility. Your continued insubordination has compromised federal security operations and demonstrated unfitness for federal employment." The threat to Elena's career was delivered loudly enough to be heard by everyone in the surrounding circle, and Marcus noted that several senior federal officials had overheard Victoria's angry dismissal of a security supervisor who was attempting to follow proper protocols. James's livestream audience had grown to 150,000 viewers, many of whom were now sharing clips across professional networks and social media platforms. Transportation attorneys were posting analysis of federal personnel protection laws, while government ethics specialists were commenting on potential violations of administrative authority. "I want everyone watching this to understand what we're seeing," James narrated. "A deputy secretary is threatening to end the career of a security supervisor who questioned the detention of a federal official whose credentials have been verified through multiple databases." Marcus's phone buzzed again with a text from his Chief of Staff, Chairman Thompson. "Secretary Williams is concerned about your delay. Congressional leadership is asking questions about the safety briefing schedule." Should I provide an explanation? Marcus considered the message carefully. His staff could resolve this situation immediately by involving Secretary Williams directly, but doing so would prevent the full documentation of how Victoria treated federal personnel when she believed her authority was unchallenged. Deputy Secretary Ashworth. Marcus said calmly, "I appreciate the thoroughness of your security screening, but I believe we've reached a point where continued delays are affecting federal operations. Secretary Williams is expecting my participation in today's safety briefing." Victoria stared at him with the kind of desperate calculation typically seen in people who had committed to courses of action that were proving disastrous, but felt unable to retreat. "Mr. Thompson, your references to federal operations and Secretary Williams require verification through proper channels. Enhanced screening will help determine the legitimacy of your claimed federal relationships." The assertion that Marcus's relationship with the Transportation Secretary required verification was so obviously unreasonable that Federal Air Marshal Chen visibly winced. Elena Rodriguez shook her head in disbelief, while Sarah Hamilton stared at Victoria with open amazement. Patricia Wells approached Victoria with obvious professional concern. "Deputy Secretary Ashworth. Chairman Thompson's federal credentials and official relationships are matters of public record. Continued detention appears to lack security justification." Victoria turned toward Wells with barely controlled desperation. "Inspector General Wells, your questions about security determinations suggest unfamiliarity with the discretionary authority of senior federal officials in high-security situations." The response revealed Victoria's growing isolation as the federal personnel she'd summoned to support her position instead raised questions about her approach. Elena Rodriguez had documented irregularities in security procedures, Federal Air. Marshal Chen had confirmed Marcus's credentials through law enforcement databases, and Inspector General Wells had found no evidence to support enhanced screening. Marcus recognized that Victoria had reached a point where acknowledging error would require admitting that she'd spent 45 minutes publicly challenging a senior federal official, whose identity and credentials were easily verifiable. Her continued escalation suggested someone who valued personal authority more than professional competence or administrative integrity. The situation was about to shift dramatically as Transportation Secretary Williams himself had grown tired of waiting for his NTSB Chairman to deliver the opening safety briefing that would set the tone for the entire Federal Aviation Summit. Transportation Secretary Michael Williams strode through the Executive Federal Aviation Lounge with the kind of purposeful energy that cleared pathways and commanded immediate attention. At 62, Williams had spent 15 years in federal transportation leadership, and his presence in any room signaled that significant decisions were about to be made. His arrival at the marble registration desk where Victoria Ashworth was conducting her extended security screening drew every eye in the vicinity. Marcus Secretary Williams called out as he approached, his voice carrying the easy familiarity of officials who had worked together on complex policy initiatives for years. "There you are. We've been holding the safety briefing for 20 minutes. Congressional leadership is asking questions about the delay." The casual use of Marcus's first name, combined with Williams's obvious expectation that the NTSB Chairman would be immediately available for federal operations, created a moment of perfect silence in the Executive Federal Aviation Lounge. Every conversation within 30 feet stopped as federal officials, industry executives, and aviation specialists processed what they were witnessing. Victoria Ashworth stood frozen in the center of the circle, her face cycling through expressions of shock, disbelief, and dawning horror, as she recognized her direct supervisor approaching the man she'd been detaining for nearly an hour, based on questionable security concerns. Secretary Williams Marcus replied with the same calm courtesy he'd maintained throughout Victoria's interrogation. "I've been experiencing some delays with security screening procedures. Deputy Secretary Ashworth has been very thorough in verifying my credentials." Williams glanced around the circle of federal personnel, his expression shifting from mild irritation to serious concern as he recognized the formal law enforcement presence and official investigative stance surrounding his NTSB chairman. Deputy Secretary Ashworth Williams said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that ended careers and redirected federal policies. "Why is Chairman Thompson being subjected to enhanced security screening? His attendance at today's summit was specifically requested by the White House Office of Transportation Policy." The question hung in the air like a judicial pronouncement, and Victoria understood that her response would determine not only the immediate outcome of this situation, but her future prospects within federal transportation leadership. Elena Rodriguez watched with mixture of vindication and professional concern, recognizing that her attempts to question Victoria's security procedures had been correct, but understanding that challenging a deputy secretary had probably ended her own career regardless of the outcome. James Mitchell's live stream had exploded to 200,000 concurrent viewers as news of Secretary Williams's arrival spread across transportation networks and social media platforms. His audience now included congressional staff members, White House transportation officials, and international aviation authorities who were witnessing the most dramatic federal transportation confrontation in recent memory. Federal Air Marshal Chen stepped forward with obvious relief at the arrival of clear federal authority. "Secretary Williams, sir, we were requested to provide security support for enhanced credential verification. Chairman Thompson's identification has been confirmed through multiple federal databases." Williams turned towards Chen with sharp attention. "Marshal Chen, what security concerns required enhanced screening of NTSB personnel at a federal aviation summit?" Chen glanced uncertainly toward Victoria before responding. "Sir, Deputy Secretary Ashworth identified database inconsistencies that suggested credential verification issues. However, our investigation has confirmed Chairman Thompson's identity and federal authorization. Williams's expression darkened as he processed the implications of Chen's response. Database inconsistencies. Marshal Chen, the NTSB Chairman's federal credentials are verified daily through White House security systems. What inconsistencies could possibly justify detention of senior transportation officials? Patricia Wells, the Inspector General investigator, approached Williams with obvious professional discomfort. Secretary Williams, our preliminary review hasn't identified security concerns that would support enhanced screening procedures for Chairman Thompson. His federal credentials appear to be properly documented and current. Williams stared at Wells with growing incredulity. Inspector General Wells, you're telling me that federal investigators were summoned to conduct enhanced screening of the NTSB chairman based on credential concerns that don't actually exist? The question was delivered with enough authority to make Wells step back involuntarily, but she maintained professional composure while confirming that Victoria's security concerns appeared to lack factual foundation. Marcus watched the exchange with particular interest, noting how quickly the power dynamic had shifted once Secretary Williams arrived to establish clear federal hierarchy. Victoria's confident authority had evaporated in the presence of someone whose position unquestionably exceeded her own. Sarah Hamilton approached Secretary Williams with diplomatic professionalism. Secretary Williams, I'm Sarah Hamilton with Airport VIP Services. I want to apologize for any complications with Chairman Thompson's visit today. Our facility should have prevented these security irregularities through better advance coordination. Williams acknowledged Sarah's apology with professional courtesy before turning his full attention to Victoria, who had remained silent since his arrival, while apparently calculating her response to a situation that had become professionally catastrophic. Deputy Secretary Ashworth Williams said, his voice carrying the kind of cold precision typically reserved for congressional oversight hearings. I need a complete explanation of the security concerns that justified detaining the NTSB chairman for nearly an hour at a federal aviation summit. Victoria understood that any response would be documented by James's live stream observed by federal personnel, whose respect she needed for future effectiveness and reviewed by transportation industry officials who would determine her professional credibility for years to come. Secretary Williams Victoria began carefully initial credential verification, raised questions about database consistency that appeared to warrant enhanced security screening. Mr. Thompson's casual appearance and unusual presentation suggested that additional verification might be appropriate for facility security. The explanation was delivered with as much dignity as Victoria could manage, but every word revealed the discriminatory assumptions that had driven her aggressive approach to what should have been routine credential verification. Williams stared at Victoria with the kind of cold assessment typically reserved for officials who had committed serious administrative violations. Deputy Secretary Ashworth, you're telling me that you detained the NTSB chairman because of his casual appearance and unusual presentation. The repetition of Victoria's own words made her discriminatory reasoning clear to everyone present, and Marcus noted the immediate change in body language among federal officials who recognized the implications of her statement. Elena Rodriguez approached Williams with professional determination despite Victoria's threats to her career. Secretary Williams I observed this entire interaction from the beginning. Chairman Thompson provided legitimate federal identification immediately upon request. The extended security screening appeared to exceed standard protocols without clear justification. Williams nodded toward Elena with obvious respect for her professional courage. Supervisor Rodriguez, thank you for that information. Your adherence to proper security protocols under difficult circumstances reflects well on federal aviation security operations. Victoria watched with growing desperation as Williams publicly supported the security supervisor she'd threatened with career termination for questioning her approach. Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from his Chief of Staff, Chairman Thompson. CNN is requesting a statement about the security incident. Reuters and Associated Press are also calling. Should I refer them to your public affairs office? Marcus realized that Victoria's public detention of a federal transportation official had attracted national news attention, transforming what had begun as discriminatory security screening into a story that would be covered by major media outlets and analyzed by government affairs specialists. Secretary Williams Marcus said calmly, "I believe we should proceed with today's safety briefing." The congressional leadership and White House transportation officials are expecting policy announcements that shouldn't be delayed further by administrative complications. Williams checked his watch, recognizing that the Federal Aviation Summit was already behind schedule due to Victoria's extended security procedures. "You're absolutely right, Marcus. We need to address the safety protocols immediately." He turned toward Victoria with the kind of official displeasure that ended federal careers. "Deputy Secretary Ashworth will discuss today's security procedures in detail after the summit. Your approach to federal personnel management requires immediate review and correction." Victoria understood that Williams's statement constituted formal notice that her conduct was under investigation by her direct supervisor, a development that would be reported throughout federal transportation circles within hours. James Mitchell's live stream had become the most watched federal transportation event in social media history, with viewers sharing clips across professional networks, news platforms, and policy forums. Transportation attorneys were posting analysis of federal personnel protection laws, while government ethics specialists were commenting on potential violations of administrative authority. Marcus walked alongside Secretary Williams toward the briefing auditorium, noting that Victoria remained surrounded by the federal investigators she'd summoned to support her detention of senior transportation officials. Her confident authority had been replaced by obvious professional isolation, as the law enforcement personnel who had backed her approach now questioned the security assessment that had justified their involvement. Elena Rodriguez approached Marcus as he prepared to leave the registration area. "Chairman Thompson, I want to apologize again for the irregularities in security procedures. Federal Aviation Security will review today's events to prevent similar incidents in the future." Marcus smiled reassuringly. "Supervisor Rodriguez, you handled an extremely difficult situation with professionalism and integrity. Your commitment to proper protocols reflects excellent training and sound judgment. The public praise from the NTSB Chairman, delivered in the presence of Transportation Secretary Williams and documented by live-stream coverage, effectively ended any possibility that Victoria's threats would affect Elena's federal career." As Marcus entered the briefing auditorium to deliver his presentation on new aviation safety protocols, he reflected on the perfect demonstration Victoria had provided of exactly why those protocols were necessary. Her treatment of federal personnel based on appearance and assumptions revealed the same kind of discriminatory thinking that compromised safety when applied to passenger screening, pilot training, and aviation security operations. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus that Victoria's attempt to challenge his authority had created the ideal platform to announce new federal requirements for bias training, accountability measures, and discrimination prevention in all aspects of federal transportation operations. Marcus Thompson walked to the podium in the Federal Aviation Summit's main auditorium with the same calm composure he'd maintained throughout Victoria Ashworth's extended interrogation. The audience of 300 federal officials, airline executives, and international aviation authorities had been waiting for nearly an hour, and murmurs of curiosity about the delay rippled through the crowd as the NTSB Chairman began his opening presentation. "Good afternoon," Marcus said, his voice carrying clearly through the auditorium's sophisticated sound system. "Before we begin today's discussion of new aviation safety protocols, I'd like to address an incident that just occurred in our executive lounge that perfectly illustrates why these new protocols are necessary." James Mitchell had positioned himself near the auditorium entrance, his live stream now reaching 250,000 concurrent viewers as transportation industry networks shared links across professional platforms. His audience included congressional staff members monitoring federal transportation policy, international aviation officials attending the summit virtually, and news organizations that had begun covering the story of a federal official's discriminatory detention. 30 minutes ago, Marcus continued, I was detained for nearly an hour by federal transportation officials who questioned my identity and credentials based primarily on my casual appearance and what was described as my unusual presentation. Despite providing legitimate federal identification immediately upon request, I was subjected to enhanced security screening that involved federal law enforcement and Inspector General investigators. The auditorium fell completely silent as federal officials processed what the NTSB Chairman was telling them. Several attendees pulled out phones to begin recording while others exchanged glances of shock and concern. Marcus gestured toward the back of the auditorium where Victoria Ashworth had just entered with obvious reluctance. Deputy Secretary Ashworth, who initiated the security screening, spent considerable time explaining to federal personnel that my credentials required verification because I didn't appear to belong in federal facilities. Victoria stood frozen near the auditorium entrance, understanding that the NTSB Chairman was using the summit's most prominent platform to document her discriminatory approach to federal security operations. This incident, Marcus continued, demonstrates exactly why the NTSB is implementing comprehensive bias prevention requirements for all federal transportation operations effective immediately. Discrimination in security screening, passenger treatment, and personnel management compromises safety by prioritizing assumptions over evidence and prejudice over professionalism. Elena Rodriguez entered the auditorium as Marcus spoke, her expression reflecting mixture of vindication and concern about the professional consequences of challenging a deputy secretary. She found a seat near the front, understanding that the NTSB Chairman was transforming her difficult decision to question Victoria's approach into validation of proper federal security protocols. James's live-stream chat was moving too fast to read, as viewers posted reactions ranging from outrage about Victoria's behavior to praise for Marcus's composed response to analysis of the broader implications for federal transportation policy. Transportation attorneys were sharing legal commentary about discrimination in federal facilities, while aviation industry executives were discussing the potential impact on airline security procedures. The new protocols Marcus announced will require comprehensive bias training for all federal transportation personnel, mandatory documentation of security screening decisions, and regular auditing of credential verification procedures to ensure consistent application of professional standards. Secretary Williams, seated in the front row, nodded approvingly as Marcus outlined policy changes that would address exactly the kind of discriminatory treatment he'd just experienced. The Secretary's public support for the NTSB Chairman's response effectively ended any possibility that Victoria's approach could be defended as legitimate security operations. Additionally, Marcus continued the NTSB is establishing the Federal Transportation Dignity Initiative, a program funded with $25 million over 3 years to address discrimination throughout the transportation industry. This initiative will provide training resources, support legal challenges to discriminatory practices, and ensure that federal transportation facilities maintain professional standards, regardless of travelers' appearance, background, or assumptions about their status. The audience erupted in sustained applause as federal officials, industry executives, and international authorities recognized the significance of Marcus's announcement. Victoria Ashworth's discriminatory security screening had inadvertently created the political momentum for the most comprehensive anti-discrimination program in federal transportation history. Patricia Wells, the Inspector General investigator who had been summoned to support Victoria's enhanced security screening, approached the auditorium entrance where Victoria remained standing in obvious professional isolation. Deputy Secretary Ashworth Wells said quietly, "The Inspector General's office will be conducting a formal review of today's security procedures. Your availability for interview will be required." Victoria understood that the investigator she'd called to support her detention of Marcus Thompson was now informing her that she was the subject of federal investigation for potential abuse of administrative authority. Federal Air Marshal Chen had remained near the auditorium entrance, his expression reflecting professional embarrassment about his involvement in what had proven to be discriminatory harassment of a senior federal official. He approached Victoria with obvious discomfort. Ma'am, federal law enforcement will be reviewing today's security operations to determine whether proper procedures were followed. Victoria realized that every federal agency that had supported her approach was now distancing themselves from her security assessment and questioning the judgment that had led to Marcus Thompson's detention. Marcus concluded his presentation with direct address to the transportation industry officials in his audience. Discrimination isn't just morally wrong, it's operationally dangerous. When we allow bias to influence security decisions, passenger treatment, or personnel management, we compromise the professional judgment that aviation safety requires. Today's incident demonstrates why federal transportation operations must be guided by evidence rather than assumptions, by competence rather than appearance, and by respect for human dignity rather than prejudice disguised as security consciousness. James Mitchell's live stream had reached 300,000 concurrent viewers, making it the most-watched federal transportation event in social media history. News organizations were already preparing coverage of the story, while transportation policy specialists were analyzing the immediate and long-term implications of Marcus's policy announcements. Sarah Hamilton watched from the VIP services area, understanding that Marcus had transformed what could have been a personal grievance into an opportunity for industry-wide improvement. His response demonstrated the kind of leadership that addressed underlying problems, rather than simply seeking individual vindication. Elena Rodriguez approached the podium as Marcus finished his presentation, her professional courage validated by the NTSB Chairman's public support for proper security protocols. Chairman Thompson, she said formally, Federal Aviation Security will implement your new bias prevention requirements immediately. Today's incident will serve as a case study for training programs across all federal transportation facilities. Marcus shook Elena's hand warmly, understanding that her willingness to question Victoria's approach, despite career risks, had provided essential documentation of discriminatory security procedures. Victoria Ashworth left the auditorium quietly understanding that her federal transportation career had ended the moment she decided to challenge Marcus Thompson's credentials based on his casual appearance. Her confidence in federal authority had been replaced by recognition that real power belonged to officials who earned respect through competence, rather than demanding compliance through position. As attendees filed out of the auditorium to continue summit discussions, Marcus reflected on Jessica's voice from their Sunday evening conversations about workplace discrimination and professional challenges. She'd always reminded him that the goal wasn't to prove he belonged in rooms where others questioned his presence. The goal was to change the rooms themselves. Today, standing at the podium where transportation officials made policies affecting millions of travelers, Marcus had done exactly that. Victoria's discriminatory treatment had become the foundation for federal requirements that would protect future generations from experiencing similar bias in transportation facilities across the country. The immediate aftermath of Marcus Thompson's presentation reverberated through federal transportation circles with the force of a seismic shift. Within 2 hours of his announcement, Transportation Secretary Williams had issued a departmental directive requiring immediate implementation of bias prevention protocols across all DOT facilities. The directive specifically referenced the security irregularities involving the NTSB Chairman as evidence that existing procedures were inadequate to prevent discriminatory treatment of federal personnel and civilian travelers. Victoria Ashworth's federal career effectively ended before she left the Ronald Reagan Airport complex. By 4:00 p.m. that Tuesday afternoon, she had received formal notice from the Inspector General's office that her conduct was under federal investigation, a letter from Secretary Williams requesting her immediate resignation, and calls from transportation industry headhunters advising her that private sector opportunities would be limited, given the public nature of her professional misconduct. Elena Rodriguez found herself in the unexpected position of being promoted rather than punished for challenging a deputy secretary's authority. Secretary Williams personally called Elena to commend her adherence to proper security protocols under difficult circumstances, and by the end of the week she had been offered the newly created position of Federal Aviation Equality Compliance Director with responsibility for implementing Marcus's bias prevention requirements across the entire federal transportation system. Supervisor Rodriguez's Secretary Williams had told her during their phone conversation, "Your professional courage in questioning inappropriate security procedures demonstrates exactly the kind of leadership we need to ensure that federal transportation facilities maintain the highest standards of equal treatment and professional conduct." James Mitchell's live-stream documentation of Victoria's discriminatory conduct had been viewed over 2 million times within 48 hours, making it the most widely shared federal transportation content in social media history. His audience had grown from transportation policy specialists to general news consumers interested in stories about accountability and justice in federal government operations. What we witnessed James explain to his expanded audience wasn't just one official abusing authority. It was a perfect demonstration of how bias operates in federal facilities every day, usually without documentation or consequences. Chairman Thompson's response shows how real leadership transforms individual discrimination into opportunities for institutional change. Sarah Hamilton had been contacted by multiple news organizations seeking background information about the incident, but she had declined most interview requests in favor of working with federal officials to improve VIP services coordination with security operations. The goal, she explained to her staff, isn't to relitigate what happened, but to ensure our facility sets the standard for respectful treatment of all visitors regardless of their appearance or our assumptions about their status. Marcus returned to his NTSB headquarters the morning after the summit to find his staff fielding calls from congressional offices, news organizations, civil rights groups, and transportation industry associations seeking information about the Federal Transportation Dignity Initiative he had announced. His chief of staff had compiled a list of over 100 organizations requesting partnership opportunities, funding applications, or policy consultation related to the anti-discrimination program. Chairman Thompson, his communications director, reported CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, and all 3 major networks are requesting interviews. The Washington Post and New York Times want to discuss the broader implications for federal personnel management. Transportation industry publications are calling this a watershed moment for aviation equality. Marcus reviewed the media requests while considering how to maintain focus on policy implementation rather than personal publicity. Schedule interviews with outlets that cover transportation policy seriously, he decided. The goal is to build support for bias prevention requirements, not to relitigate yesterday's incident. His daughter Zoe called that evening from Georgetown University, her voice reflecting pride and concern in equal measure. "Dad, I saw the video of what happened. Mom would be proud of how you handled it, but I'm furious that you had to experience that kind of treatment in a federal facility." Marcus smiled at his daughter's characteristic mixture of emotional honesty and political analysis. "Zoe, discrimination exists at every level of transportation operations. Yesterday's incident created an opportunity to address patterns that affect millions of travelers who don't have federal credentials to protect them." The Federal Transportation Dignity Initiative began operations within a month of Marcus's announcement, with Elena Rodriguez leading implementation of bias prevention training across federal transportation facilities. The program's first initiative involved comprehensive review of security procedures at all major airports, with particular attention to consistency of treatment across different passenger demographics. Victoria Ashworth's resignation from federal service had been accepted within a week, though her attempts to find equivalent private sector employment had been complicated by the public nature of her discriminatory conduct. Transportation industry executives understood that hiring someone associated with federal bias incidents would create public relations complications that outweighed her policy expertise. Victoria was technically competent, one airline CEO explained privately, but her approach to authority demonstrates judgment problems that make her unsuitable for senior leadership positions. The transportation industry can't afford to employ executives who treat people based on appearance rather than credentials. Victoria eventually found employment with a small consulting firm specializing in regulatory compliance at a salary roughly half of her federal compensation. Her political aspirations had ended permanently, and her influence within transportation policy circles had evaporated along with her federal position. Federal Air Marshal Chen had requested additional training on appropriate security procedures for federal personnel, recognizing that his involvement in Victoria's discriminatory screening reflected inadequate preparation for complex jurisdictional situations. I supported Deputy Secretary Ashworth's security assessment without independently verifying the basis for enhanced screening he acknowledged in his report to federal law enforcement supervisors. Future operations will require clear documentation of security concerns before involving federal law enforcement in credential verification. Patricia Wells, the Inspector General investigator, had completed her review of the incident within 2 weeks, concluding that Victoria's detention of Marcus Thompson lacked legitimate security justification and reflected discriminatory bias rather than professional security consciousness. Her report became a training document for federal personnel management courses, illustrating how personal prejudice could compromise administrative judgment and create legal liabilities for federal agencies. The broader transportation industry had responded to Marcus's policy announcements with enthusiasm that surprised even veteran aviation executives. Airlines, airports, and transportation companies began implementing voluntary bias prevention programs before federal requirements took effect. Recognizing that discrimination created operational inefficiencies as well as legal risks, Chairman Thompson's experience demonstrates that bias affects transportation operations at every level, explained the president of the Airlines for America Trade Association. Eliminating discrimination isn't just about fairness, it's about maintaining professional standards that keep transportation systems safe and efficient. Marcus's congressional testimony about the incident, delivered 6 weeks after the summit had drawn the largest audience for transportation oversight hearings in recent memory. Congressional representatives from both parties praised his measured response to discriminatory treatment and supported expanded funding for bias prevention programs. Chairman Thompson, the House Transportation Committee chairwoman, had concluded your transformation of personal discrimination into institutional reform demonstrates exactly the kind of leadership federal transportation agencies need. The committee will support comprehensive funding for bias prevention initiatives across all transportation modes. The Jessica Thompson Transportation Equity Foundation, named for Marcus's late wife and funded through his personal resources, had begun operations with focus on supporting travelers who experienced discrimination but lacked the resources or authority to address it through normal channels. The foundation provided legal assistance, documented patterns of discriminatory treatment, and advocated for policy changes that would prevent future incidents. Elena Rodriguez had thrown herself into implementing bias prevention requirements with the passion of someone whose professional integrity had been validated by challenging inappropriate authority. Her federal training programs were being adapted by international aviation authorities, and her work had attracted attention from United Nations transportation officials interested in developing global standards for equal treatment in aviation facilities. Sarah Hamilton had become an unofficial spokesperson for hospitality industry approaches to respectful customer service, speaking at conferences about the importance of treating all visitors with dignity, regardless of appearance or assumptions about status. Hospitality begins with respect became her signature message. Everything else follows from that foundation. Marcus continued his regular travel schedule, but now he was frequently recognized by transportation personnel who had seen coverage of the summit incident. Flight attendants, gate agents, and security screeners often approached him to express support for bias prevention requirements or to share their own experiences with discrimination in transportation settings. 3 months after the summit, Marcus returned to Ronald Reagan Airport for another federal aviation meeting. Elena Rodriguez met him at the executive lounge entrance, her new federal credentials identifying her as Director of Federal Aviation Equality Compliance. Chairman Thompson Elena said with obvious professional satisfaction, "Welcome back to a facility that now maintains the highest standards for equal treatment of all visitors. The bias prevention protocols you announced have been implemented across all federal transportation facilities nationwide." Marcus looked around the marble-floored lounge where Victoria Ashworth had detained him based on his casual appearance, noting the new signage prominently displaying passenger rights and anti-discrimination policies in multiple languages. Federal personnel wore badges indicating completion of bias prevention training, and supervisors conducted regular audits to ensure consistent application of respectful treatment standards. The transformation was visible in daily operations rather than policy documents. Marcus observed passengers of all backgrounds moving through security and facility access procedures with equal efficiency and courtesy, while federal personnel applied professional service standards consistently across all interactions. On a crisp Saturday morning, 6 months after the Federal Aviation Summit incident, Marcus Thompson stood at his wife Jessica's graveside in Arlington National Cemetery holding the folded program from the first annual Federal Transportation Dignity Conference. The program featured Jessica's photograph alongside the Foundation mission statement, ensuring dignity and respect for all travelers in memory of those we've lost to preventable discrimination and negligence. Jess Marcus said quietly, "You always told me the goal wasn't to prove I belonged in rooms where people questioned my presence. The goal was to change the rooms themselves." He smiled slightly. "I think you'd approve of what happened next." The October breeze carried the distant sound of aircraft departing Reagan National Airport, where Elena Rodriguez was conducting the monthly bias prevention training session that had become the gold standard for federal transportation facilities worldwide. Elena's program had been adopted by airports across Europe, Asia, and South America, making the principles Marcus had announced after Victoria's discriminatory conduct a global standard for aviation equality. Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from his daughter Zoe, now a senior at Georgetown preparing for law school applications focused on transportation civil rights law. Dad saw the news coverage of this week's foundation grants. Mom would love that her scholarship fund has supported 47 aviation students from underrepresented communities. You're changing the industry one person at a time. The Jessica Thompson Transportation Equity Foundation had grown beyond Marcus's initial vision, supporting not only bias prevention programs, but also educational opportunities for young people interested in aviation careers. The foundation's scholarship recipients were beginning to graduate from pilot training programs, aviation management courses, and aerospace engineering degrees, creating a new generation of transportation professionals committed to equality and excellence. Victoria Ashworth had moved to a small consulting practice in suburban Virginia, her federal transportation career permanently ended by her decision to detain a senior official based on appearance rather than credentials. She occasionally saw news coverage of Marcus's policy initiatives or Elena's international training programs, reminders of how quickly authority could evaporate when exercised inappropriately. Victoria's consulting work focused on regulatory compliance for small transportation companies, a significant reduction from her previous role shaping federal aviation policy for the entire nation. Her experience had become a cautionary tale in government management courses about the importance of exercising federal authority professionally rather than personally. James Mitchell had transformed his transportation policy documentation into a full-time career with his live stream coverage of federal meetings and policy discussions, drawing audiences of federal employees, industry professionals, and citizens interested in government accountability. His documentation of Victoria's discriminatory conduct had established precedent for transparency in federal operations that had influenced policy discussions across multiple agencies. The live stream wasn't just about exposing one official's misconduct, James explained to journalism students studying his work. It was about demonstrating how technology can create accountability in federal facilities where discrimination previously occurred without documentation or consequences. Sarah Hamilton had been promoted to Regional VIP Services Director with responsibility for implementing respectful hospitality standards across airports throughout the eastern United States. Her approach to customer service had become a model for international airport authorities, and she regularly spoke at conferences about the connection between dignified treatment and operational excellence. Federal Air Marshal Chen had completed additional training in federal personnel recognition and jurisdictional authority, becoming an instructor for law enforcement officers who worked in complex federal environments. His experience with Victoria's inappropriate security requests had contributed to revised protocols that required independent verification of security concerns before involving federal law enforcement in credential verification. Patricia Wells, the Inspector General investigator, had used her report on the summit incident to develop comprehensive guidelines for federal personnel protection that had been adopted across multiple agencies. Her work had established clear standards for appropriate security screening that balanced legitimate safety concerns with protection against discriminatory harassment. Marcus returned to his NTSB headquarters Monday morning to find his staff preparing for the congressional hearing, where he would present the first annual report on Federal Transportation Dignity Initiative outcomes. The statistics were remarkable. Discrimination complaints in federal transportation facilities had decreased by 73%, while customer satisfaction ratings had reached record levels across all transportation modes. The policy changes implemented after Victoria's discriminatory conduct had created measurable improvements in both equality and efficiency throughout federal transportation operations. Bias prevention training had enhanced professional competence, while reducing legal liabilities and consistent application of respectful treatment standards had improved operational effectiveness across airlines, airports, and federal facilities. Elena Rodriguez called Marcus that afternoon to share the international recognition their bias prevention program had received from the International Civil Aviation Organization. Chairman Thompson, she said with obvious pride, ICAO is recommending our training protocols as the global standard for aviation equality. 23 countries have already implemented programs based on our model. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus that Victoria's attempt to challenge his authority based on appearance had created the foundation for international transportation equality standards that would protect millions of travelers from experiencing similar discrimination. His daughter Zoe visited that weekend her law school application essays focusing on transportation civil rights and the intersection of federal authority with individual dignity. "Dad," she said as they reviewed her application materials, "I want to continue the work you started after Mom died. There are still too many transportation systems where bias affects safety, and too many people who don't have federal credentials to protect them when discrimination occurs." Marcus smiled at his daughter's commitment to continuing Jessica's passion for transportation justice. "Zoe, the foundation is yours when you're ready for it. But remember what your mother always said. Real change happens when good people refuse to accept that discrimination is simply the way things work." 3 months later, Marcus received a letter from a young black pilot who had been hired by a major airline after graduating from the Foundation's scholarship program. Chairman Thompson, the letter read, "I wanted to thank you for creating opportunities that didn't exist when you were starting your career. Because of your work, I've never experienced the discrimination that prevented previous generations from advancing in aviation. You changed the industry in ways that are visible every day." Marcus kept the letter on his desk alongside photographs of Jessica and Zoe, reminders of why the work mattered and who it ultimately served. The transformation of individual discrimination into institutional reform had created lasting change that extended far beyond his personal experience with Victoria's inappropriate conduct. On quiet evenings in his study, Marcus often reflected on the chain of events that had begun with Victoria questioning his credentials in the Executive Federal Aviation Lounge. Her discriminatory treatment had been intended to demonstrate her authority and his unsuitability for federal facilities. Instead, it had revealed the broader patterns of bias that compromised transportation operations and created the political momentum for comprehensive reform. The Federal Transportation Dignity Initiative continued to expand with new programs addressing discrimination in maritime operations, railroad services, and interstate transportation structures. Marcus's response to personal bias had become a model for transforming individual incidents into opportunities for wide-scale change, demonstrating that real leadership often meant using power to protect others rather than simply defending oneself. Victoria's career had ended because she'd mistaken federal position for personal authority and appearance for competence. Marcus's legacy had grown because he'd understood that true influence came from creating systems that worked fairly for everyone, especially those who lacked the hidden power to protect themselves when discrimination occurred. One year, after Victoria Ashworth demanded to see his identification 3 times in the Executive Federal Aviation Lounge, Marcus Thompson returned to Ronald Reagan Airport for the dedication of the Federal Transportation Equality Training Center. The facility, built with funding from the Jessica Thompson Transportation Equity Foundation, would train federal personnel from across the nation in bias prevention, respectful customer service, and professional security protocols. Elena Rodriguez, now recognized internationally as an expert in transportation equality, stood at the podium before an audience of federal officials, airline executives, and civil rights leaders from around the world. The principles we're dedicating today, she said, emerged from one man's decision to transform personal discrimination into institutional reform. Chairman Thompson could have simply revealed his identity, ended his harassment, and moved on. Instead, he chose to document how bias operates when people think they have unchallenged power. The training center's main hall featured a wall of testimonials from travelers who had benefited from the bias prevention protocols implemented after Marcus's experience with Victoria. Passengers from every demographic wrote about respectful treatment they now received in transportation facilities' professional customer service that recognized their dignity and security procedures that balanced safety concerns with equal treatment. Marcus addressed the dedication ceremony with the same calm authority he'd maintained during Victoria's interrogation, but his message focused on the future rather than the past. Discrimination in transportation isn't just about individual bias, he explained to the audience. It's about safety efficiency and the fundamental question of whether our structures serve everyone equally. The Federal Transportation Dignity Initiative had documented measurable improvements across every category of transportation operations. Customer satisfaction had reached record levels, employee morale had improved significantly, and legal complaints related to discriminatory treatment had decreased by 85% across federal transportation facilities. The changes we've implemented prove that equality isn't just morally right, Marcus continued. It's operationally superior. When we treat people based on evidence rather than assumptions, we make better decisions. When we apply standards consistently, we achieve better results. When we respect human dignity, we build stronger institutions. Sarah Hamilton, now responsible for VIP services at airports throughout the eastern United States, had transformed hospitality protocols to ensure that every visitor experienced the kind of respectful treatment previously reserved for obviously important guests. We learned, she explained to hospitality industry conferences, that you can't provide excellent service to some people while treating others poorly. True hospitality means assuming dignity and worth in everyone you encounter. Marcus's phone contained dozens of messages from transportation professionals sharing stories about how bias prevention training had improved their workplace culture, enhanced customer relationships, and created environments where competence mattered more than assumptions about people's backgrounds or status. James Mitchell's documentation of the original incident had become required viewing in government accountability courses, journalism programs, and civil rights education. His live stream had demonstrated how individual citizens could use technology to create transparency in federal operations and hold government officials accountable for discriminatory conduct. The live stream wasn't about creating viral content, James explained to media students studying his work. It was about ensuring that discrimination couldn't occur in silence. When bias operates without documentation, it continues unchallenged. When it's recorded and shared, it becomes an opportunity for change. Victoria Ashworth's discriminatory conduct had inadvertently created the political foundation for the most comprehensive transportation equality program in federal history. Her attempt to abuse authority had revealed patterns of bias that affected millions of travelers, leading to reforms that extended far beyond her individual misconduct. The irony wasn't lost on federal transportation officials that Victoria's career had ended because she'd tried to exclude someone based on appearance, while Marcus's influence had grown because he'd used the incident to create opportunities for everyone to be treated with dignity and respect. Marcus concluded his dedication ceremony remarks with a direct appeal to the audience of transportation professionals, federal employees, and civil rights advocates. Your voice matters when you witness discrimination. Your courage matters when you question inappropriate authority. Your commitment matters when you choose to treat every person you encounter with the dignity they deserve. The ceremony concluded with the unveiling of a simple plaque that captured the essential lesson of Marcus's experience with Victoria. Equal treatment isn't achieved through policies alone. It's achieved through the daily choices individuals make to see the humanity in every person they serve. As attendees filed out of the dedication ceremony, Marcus reflected on Jessica's voice from their Sunday evening conversations about workplace challenges and social justice. She'd always reminded him that real change came from people who refused to accept that discrimination was simply the way things worked, who understood that individual dignity was more important than temporary convenience, and who used whatever power they possessed to create opportunities for others. Today, standing in a federal facility where transportation officials from around the world were learning to recognize and prevent bias, Marcus understood that Jessica's vision had been realized. The structure that had failed her, that had allowed cost-cutting and negligence to compromise airline safety, had been transformed into one that prioritized human dignity alongside operational excellence. The Federal Transportation Equality Training Center would train thousands of federal personnel, annually creating a generation of transportation professionals committed to treating every traveler with respect, regardless of their appearance, background, or perceived status. Victoria's discriminatory conduct had planted seeds that had grown into institutional change affecting millions of people across the globe. Marcus's legacy wouldn't be measured by his response to individual discrimination, but by the countless future travelers who would experience respectful treatment because bias prevention had become standard practice rather than optional courtesy. Jessica's death had inspired him to build safer aviation structures. Victoria's misconduct had enabled him to build more equitable ones. Sometimes Marcus told visitors to Jessica's grave on quiet weekend mornings. The most powerful response to injustice isn't immediate confrontation. Sometimes it's strategic patience followed by comprehensive transformation that ensures the same injustice can't happen to others. The man who had been told he didn't belong in a federal facility because of his casual appearance had transformed that facility and thousands like it into places where everyone belonged, where dignity was assumed rather than earned, and where federal authority served justice rather than personal prejudice. If you've ever experienced discrimination in transportation, witnessed bias in professional settings, or wondered whether individual voices can create institutional change, remember Marcus Thompson's story. Change begins with people who refuse to accept that prejudice is permanent, who understand that real authority serves others rather than self, and who transform personal pain into universal progress. Share this story if it reminded you that justice delayed isn't always justice denied. Sometimes it's justice transformed into something larger than individual vindication, something that reaches beyond personal experience to create lasting change for generations who will never know the discrimination that previous generations endured. Your dignity matters. Your voice matters. Your commitment to treating others with respect matters. And sometimes when you combine patience with principle and strategy with courage, you can change entire structures rather than just winning individual battles. If this story moved you, please hit the like button and share it with others who need to hear this message. Subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories of courage, justice, and transformation. Comment below and let us know about a time when you witnessed discrimination or stood up for what was right. Your story matters too, and together we can create a world where everyone is treated with the dignity and respect they deserve. Thank you for watching. And remember, sometimes the most powerful response to injustice isn't anger or revenge. Sometimes it's the grace to transform a moment of personal pain into an opportunity for everyone to rise higher,